Hello everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I'll be talking about the Genoa Conference and the subsequent Treaty of Rapallo of 1922. And this is very useful for IGCSE or A-level history. So let's jump right in. So what countries were present at the Genoa Conference? There were 34 European countries, and it was organized by Lord Lloyd George for Britain. Obviously also there was France, Italy, and importantly Germany and the USSR. But the United States were not there because they were still pursuing their isolationist policy after World War I. So what were the reasons for the conference or the pact? The whole name of the Genoa Conference was the Economic and Financial Conference of Genoa. And that's because its main aim was to resolve several problems in the post-war economic restructuring of Europe. Obviously, Europe had been ravaged by World War I, and there was a rampant inflationary crisis. So what does Lloyd George want to do? One of the things he wants to do is he wants to establish a European consortium. So basically an alliance of all the European states together to rebuild a defeated Germany and Central and Eastern European states, including Germany and Russia, because Lloyd George believed that a weak European economy would lead to the proliferation of communism. So it would lead to communism spreading throughout Eastern Europe, which is not what he wanted. He also wanted to address the issue of the pariah states of Germany and the USSR, improving diplomatic relationships with them after the exclusion from the Paris Peace Conferences. So in the Paris Peace Conferences, where both Germany and the USSR were not invited to participate, and that led to them being obviously excluded in European affairs. And he believes that in order to rebuild a strong and economically strong Europe, Germany and the USSR must be included in these plans. So what were the key agreements and disagreements at the Genoa Conference? So there was a partial agreement. There was a partial return to the gold standard by the central banks. However, the Genoa Conference ultimately ended in failure. So there were very, very few agreements that were actually reached. So what were their main disagreements? So why did the Genoa Conference fail? Well, the main reason is, in total, if you want to sum everything up, it was conflicting demands from either sides and sides not willing to make concessions. For example, the Allies, so basically Britain and France, wanted compensation for nationalized business from the Soviets, and the Soviets instead wanted large loans and technology from the Allies. So with the Communist Revolution of 1917, the one that took Russia out of the war, businesses were nationalized. That means that the Bolsheviks took control of many factories and businesses that belonged to foreigners, for example, belonged to Allied businesses. And the Allies wanted compensation for these businesses that had just been taken from them by the Bolsheviks. And the Soviets didn't want to do this. They didn't want to give this. Instead, they wanted large loans and technology from the Allies, which the Allies weren't willing to give. So there we have one clash of interest. Instead, we also have the strong French, Franco-German differences. The Germans, which were actually supported by the British in this, wanted a concession on the reparations issue. The Germans were being crippled by the reparations that the French demanded of them. However, the French vetoed any discussions of this. They said, no, we're not hearing this. We are not changing anything with the reparations. Germany, you must pay them in full. We're not going to help you in any way. So both the Germans and the Russians were dissatisfied for their own reasons. So they both pulled out of the conference and signed their own pact at Rapallo. And it is the Treaty of Rapallo, the fact that the Genoa Conference was sidelined basically by the Treaty of Rapallo, that ultimately led to the Genoa Conference's failure. So what was the Treaty of Rapallo? It was signed on April 16th of 1922 in Rapallo, which is very, very close to Genoa. And the key countries involved were, well, obviously Germany and Russia. It was just a bilateral treaty. They decided to meet secretly at Rapallo to form their own pact. And it was negotiated by German Foreign Minister Walter Rathenau and Russian Foreign Minister Georgy Chicherin. So they were both in Rapallo, the delegations, and they just decided to meet up secretly. So what were the reasons for the pact? So as I said before, both the Russians and the Germans were dissatisfied with the attitudes of the other European leaders and their stubbornness. The fact that they weren't willing to make any concessions. So yes, Lloyd George had invited them, even though they were pariah states, they were outcasts in European affairs. They still felt like they were not being treated fairly, and they still felt isolated from European affairs. In fact, the historian Kurt Rosenbaum said, The policies pursued by the victors, mainly France, which again we said didn't want to give any concessions to Germany, left no alternative to Germany but to move closer to Russia. So what were the key agreements reached by Germany and Russia in the Treaty of Rapallo? So firstly, there was the mutual cancellations of war debts. Basically, both Germany owed money to Russia and Russia owed money to Germany after the war, and they both canceled these debts. Germany pledged to consult with Moscow before participating in any international plans. So basically, they're forging a bond, like an alliance. Germany officially recognized the Bolshevik communist government of the Soviet Union. This is important because Russia had turned to the Bolshevik government and had turned communist in 1917 during World War I, and none of the European powers ever accepted this government, the communist government. They didn't want to accept that Russia had turned communist. So Germany is the first country to officially recognize this, and this is a big diplomatic win for Soviet Russia. They also, mutual diplomatic recognition and mutual economic cooperation. A very important fact as well is that the Rapallo Treaty also provided diplomatic cover for secret military cooperation. So this was a secret term, a secret clause of the treaty, which allowed Germany to rebuild its military in Russia. If we remember the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany's army was very, very greatly restricted, but Germany had always seen its army as a source of pride, and they really, really want to rebuild this. So Russia, the Treaty of Rapallo gives Germany cover to do this secretly in Russia. Another reason for the Treaty of Rapallo was that Germany had the modernity, the military modernity and technology that Russia had strived for. In fact, that's also what they asked from the Allies, but the Allies refused. And Russia had the space and the resources that Germany craved, for example, to rebuild its military arsenal, among other things. Okay, so now on to impact. Did this improve or worsen tensions? Obviously it improved tensions between Germany and Russia. However, in total, it greatly worsened tensions in Europe. Rapallo led to the collapse of the Genoa Conference, which is one of the big major conferences after the Paris Peace Conferences, which brought kind of all of Europe together, and therefore greatly intensified the tensions between Germany and the USSR on one side, and the rest of the European powers, and mainly France, which is really, really suspicious of course, Germany, but also of the USSR, and so was Britain. Also, with no major agreements reached and prevalently disagreements at the conference, international relations only worsened and tensions between nations rose. The Genoa Conference was a failure, and there's really no other way to spin this. Anyway, that's all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe if you enjoyed this video and you found it useful. Leave a comment if there's anything in particular you want to see, and see you in the next video.